Of course, we've been looking at baptism, and we went over quite a bit. Started out, of course, the study with just, how to study, looked at some thoughts about that, and then picked up baptism as John administered it. We looked at, really tried to look real good at the Greek words and the usage in the Bible. We touched on some ideas about the kingdom one night. We've looked at the baptism that John administered. We came forward into the New Testament. We looked at the baptism that was administered in the New Testament. And from the first night, I told y'all we were going to get into some history one night, or some nights, whatever. But I'm going to do that tonight, and I want to do that here in just a minute. There's not a new piece of paper. I don't have any specific outline laid out for you, so there's probably a good deal of reading history that I'm going to do tonight just to get some basic ideas in front of you. But I will tell you this, as far as the histories that I'm going to be referencing tonight, that I'm going to read from, all of them you can find on a website called the Baptist History homepage. If you have not looked at that, I would strongly recommend it. A huge amount of really good material on there. A lot of the histories that we will reference back to from time to time. And it's all there, it's all free.
It was called?
Do what?
It was called?
Baptist History homepage. And it's even a pretty decent laid out. It's easy to find your way around. I would recommend to you, if you're just looking for something to read real quick one night and you have a few minutes, get on there and start reading Baptist circular letters. I think that's some of the best writing that's ever been done, because it deals specifically with a doctrinal point. And those older brethren took their time, and they would be appointed to write the circular letter, and then it would be circulated among the churches in the association. And there's some really good circular letters on there, especially out of Kentucky. The guy that runs that, I think, is in Kentucky, isn't he? Somewhere. Yeah. But at any rate, most of the stuff, now the exception, and it may actually be on there, I didn't get my copy from there that I'm going to be looking at, but it'd be the same any place you look at it, is the Trail of Blood. But of course most of y'all are familiar with that. And I also tried real hard to pick things tonight, especially with the Trail of Blood. And if you want to study church history and not just read a book, actually want to study, I believe there's a really good outline right there. Okay? Now, it's not completely fleshed out. There's a lot of times that you'll hit a point, leave it, and keep going. That in and of itself could be an entire book. Okay? But it's a real good outline of church history, Baptist church history. Okay? So, that's my quick side note recommendation. Tonight, though, and I have a reason for this, and I hope it'll come back around and make sense. Let's go to the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel. And this is going to be our only scripture reading that I know of tonight, unless we need to read some later on for some particular reason. But we're in the 8th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. This will be some relatively familiar scripture, I would think. At least you'll know of the instance if you've not actually taken the time to read it yourself. Starting in verse 1, chapter 8, and it came to pass when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after filthy lucre, and took bribes, and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people, and all they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king, and he said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over fifties, and will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants, and your goodliest young men, and your asses, and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us, and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said unto the men of Israel, Go ye every man unto his city. Now in chapter 9, which I'm not going to read, is where we find that Saul was chosen to be king over Israel. And having finished reading that complete 8th chapter, I would imagine that most of y'all are going, what does that have to do with baptism? But stay with me for a few minutes, because we are going to look at baptism. We are going to look at the ideas of baptism, but we're going to do it from a perspective of history. But I wanted to read this scripture, and I want you to just sort of keep it in the back of your mind for a few minutes, and we hopefully will come back to it before we get done. Okay? And there's some things in there that I found that we'll get to before we get done tonight. But as we look at history, I think there is multiple ways you can approach history. Okay? One, you can approach it just exactly as what it is, like it was just a written document. Read it and memorize the dates, memorize the names, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But anytime that you really delve into history, I think what you're going to find is that there are ideas behind what actually happened that are actually driving the history that we're reading. Okay? When I was in high school, we, of course, had to take history. And when I would take history in high school, I absolutely hated it. I hated it because it was exactly what I described to you earlier. Memorize this person on this day, they did this thing. And that was it. Okay, but why did they do that? What was the outcome of them doing that? We just never delved into that. Okay? But then I got to college for part of the year, And I found out that history was one of my favorite classes. I loved it. But it wasn't about memorizing names. It wasn't about memorizing dates. It was about the ideas, the things that actually drove the history. Why was this happening? What is it that led up to this? What is it that drove us to this point? Okay? I believe that's where we really get the value of studying our Baptist history. Okay? And I say that for this reason. If you want to prove just about anything, you can find a historical document that will tell you that. Okay? Even within the last few months in this area, there was a meeting that was held that I understand, and it was dealing with a controversy that arose in the 20s. And all of a sudden, there's this guy that has come up with new information from 100 years ago. And I'm just going to tell y'all, it was one of the most written about. It was the division down at Dixon Creek. It was one of the most written about things, one of the most covered things from both sides and no side. Okay? And I say that meaning this. There were people that have written books about that from both sides, a more liberal standpoint that sort of would lean towards the excluded members being okay. Others that have written a book just as harsh as it can be against that. If y'all want to know what I think about it, I'll be glad to sit down and tell you, but that's not our subject tonight. But now, how are you going to come up 100 years after the fact and come up with new information that would change everybody's mind about what took place back there? That ain't going to happen, okay? I don't believe the value of history is for us to scotch ourselves up, all right? The Bible is what we're supposed to be doing, right? Okay? That's our guide of rule and faith. And that's why I was almost hesitant about going ahead and doing history tonight. It's not because I'm against history, but I hate to see people take history and use it like a battering ram to justify what they already believe. Okay? If you can, this is one of the things that I point out sometimes to sort of illustrate what I'm getting at. Okay? How many of y'all today, right now, believe that the Baptist churches should have men that are set aside and ordained as apostles? Is there anybody here that believes that? Thank you, Lord, for nobody raising your hand. Okay. Yet, Brother Joe gave me a book a couple of years ago. You've read it. A history of 10 Baptist churches. Okay? Of which, what was the guy's name? Taylor. He said, of which I have been a member. Okay? And he goes through his life story. And it's a good book. And it's another one I'd recommend you to read sometime. And it's more of almost reads like a novel. Because it is his history himself. But in there is the point made, and I had read it other places in history in the past, where there was an association up in northern Kentucky that they came together one year at the association. They decided they needed to have an apostle. So they talked about it. They voted on one and elected the guy as an apostle. Next year, they came back.
To be exact.
Yeah.
John Waller.
The next year, they came back and undid that. Okay? So they realized, hey, this ain't, no, we've done messed up. Which is to their credit that they realized they messed up. But if you just take that completely out of context, then you could make the argument that historically Baptist people have continued to appoint apostles. If you don't ever go read that, if you don't know the whole story about it, then you would go, wow, really? Well, yeah, y'all's association appointed them, you know. And it'd be easy to just slip that by if you're not careful. Okay? That's the danger of history, is not really reading all of history, but just going to pick a point out. And I'm afraid there's a lot of people that's really why they look at history. Okay? There'll be a specific thing that they want to prove, so instead of applying the scriptures to it, they'll go back in history, they'll find something back there that's similar to it, and they say, look here, there you go. Okay, well, so, I mean, it's a historical document, it should be accurate, but the truth of the matter is, I can show you 2 history books that were writing about the same thing, and one will say this, and one will say this. Okay? History is not inspired by God. History is not perfect. And the records that we have of history are not perfect. Okay? So always keep that in mind. That doesn't mean it's no value to it. There is value to it. But the value is not in the minute details of it. The value is in the ideas, the things that are driving history. Why did this church head this direction? Why did this preacher head this direction? That's the value of history. Okay? Because that gets past just the things they did and it gets more into the ideas, the thoughts, the reasons that they did the things they did. Okay? Does that make any sense to anybody here? Okay. Okay, so, Trail of Blood. And I do want to just hit on a few points. Okay? Specific to baptism, because that's what we're looking at. And it is important for us to understand that as we go through the Trail of Blood, what you are finding is people that are variously called Anabaptists, most recently, Anabaptists, Paulicians, Novatians, Waldensians, Albigenses, and could keep adding names to that. Okay? Multitudes of different people over different centuries, not years, centuries, okay, that have held the same principles that we now hold. Now, I think I made the point last week or the week before, one, about there's not a lot of things that you find in the scriptures where they are arguing real hard for baptism by immersion, but it's sort of silly to argue for something that's not a controversial point. Okay, so until somebody takes and changes the ordinance of baptism into sprinkling or whatever else, why would you argue about it? I mean, why debate something that we all already agree on? The Eastern Orthodox Church, which is one of the 2 divisions of Catholicism, they still baptize today by immersion. Okay, and I'm using the word baptize right there very liberally. Okay, I don't consider it baptism. I'm not saying that. Please don't take it that way. But they still use immersion as their form of baptism. Okay, now, they're baptizing babies, but it is by immersion. Okay, so they still hold to that. What you're going to find, and again, Dr. Carroll spent a lot of time, a lot of research, and these things, when you read the Trail of Blood, were presented as lectures. I think it was 6 or 7, somewhere along in there. And you're probably looking at an hour and a half, 2 hour lectures. So, and again, he's just hitting the high points. Okay? So when this was put together in a book form, what you're getting is an outline. Okay? But now, as far as baptism is concerned, and understand that according to Dr. Carroll, and I tend to agree with him, the ordinances of the church, the things that the church can be found by, is believer's baptism followed by the Lord's Supper. Okay? And that's what we've so far in this Bible study. So when he starts talking about a group of people here, then what he has found is evidence that they are a people that expect for somebody to have a spiritual relationship with God first, an experience, an experimental knowledge of salvation, and having attained that experimental knowledge of salvation, then they present themselves to the church and are baptized and become a part of that local body. Okay? Then and only then are they a fit candidate for the Lord's Supper. But that is consistent throughout this, and that's the people that he's tracing. If you want to trace our history, that's the way you've pretty much got to do it. Because as we've already mentioned, the name changes. The doctrines, the principles, they do not change. Okay? Now, he follows all the way up, and there's actually a chart in the back of it. If y'all have never seen this, the chart is somewhat helpful. It'll point out the different churches at the different times that were persecuted. And he, of course, the reference to the trail of blood is the idea that they were persecuted and cut off horribly. And you will find a lot of examples in here of martyrs, not just at the very early ages of the church, but on down through all the dark ages, and actually following up even to this continent where men were persecuted for the cause of Christ. Okay? And that blood that they shed, literally, to keep what we now have. Okay, that's what he's referencing as the trail of blood. We are fortunate, I guess, in the days that we now live, because we are not under that type of persecution. And I say we're fortunate, I guess, because it certainly seems to me that our forefathers that were under that type of persecution were much more zealous about this cause than we are.
Yeah.
When we read about people like the Waldensians, lived up in the Alps, and they lived close to the border between Italy and France, and that way if things got too rough over here, they'd move over here. And then when things got too rough over here, they'd move back over the mountain. Okay? They were constantly having to move back and forth. Their preachers during the winter, which, I mean, you're in the Alps, so you can imagine the winters there were a little more than what we are. They would get together, they would have scarce copies of the Word of God. Now, when they left there, if they went out and they were caught with a copy of the Word of God, understand at that time it was illegal, they would be killed just for possessing a portion of the Scriptures. So instead of making copies, what they would do is they would memorize it, literally. And how many of our preachers are doing that today? You know, D. Russell's about the only one I can think of that I could point that out as. Okay, but now D would memorize, you know, a verse. I can't help when I talk about D and his verses, but doing this because that's how he learned it. Put it on a note card, sit down there when he wasn't cutting hair, he'd read that verse. He'd flip it to the next one, he'd read that verse. If y'all ever remember him when he'd preach, even to the day he died, I mean, he'd throw that hand out like that, and he'd go to quoting, and he'd be doing this the whole time. And that's what he was doing. That's how he learned it. Okay? Great value in that. But these men would memorize entire books of the New Testament. Then they would leave as cobblers, as salesmen. They'd go out into places that the gospel was not and sell them their wares. And if they found a family that they felt like was interested, they would talk to them a little bit about the Lord and would go into their house, would stay with them, and that was their method of missions. Okay? And these people were what we are. And they're one that you can go back and you can look in history, you can find different things that they have written over the years and the truth that they held to. Okay? You find as we, I guess I got a little bit ahead of myself, so y'all slow me down if I get too fast on some of these things, but the marks of the church, and then going on down through this, he will start to point out, and he breaks it down into periods of time. That's going to drive me crazy. I know y'all can't hardly tell it, but that dude is circling that line. My goodness.
with my Buddhist.
But you start to see, and he traces, and I think this is one of the great values of this booklet, he traces the history of the heresy starting to emerge, okay? And as he does that, he will bring us up to the early 300s, and he'll start showing how that there was a union between the dominant church at that time, which was already apostatized, okay? Which means that they had left the faith. They were already practicing infant baptism. They had already changed the meaning of baptism, okay? And what you find is that the other churches ended up having to declare non-fellowship with them. You'll find that dominant church ended up uniting with the secular power, which was Rome, and that was the beginning of what we now call Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. And later on there was a division between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Church, and those two are the two big branches of Catholicism. And in the idea of most people, that is the history of the church. But if you will read all down through the ages of time, there was a people that they were persecuted. Okay, and they had left what the book teaches, no doubt about it. Any thinking person can see that. And I'm not, again, I'm laying out some highlights. I don't want to get into great depth on this. But he goes on down through this, and he will follow it down. He will reference different ones that wrote on this. The page I happen to have open right here, he's talking about during the 3 to 500 or 30 AD to 500. It's in that time period that they started bringing in the idea of baptismal regeneration, a doctrine that is still prevalent in this area. In any area you want to go to, they tie the redemption of the soul to the washing of the body. Okay? Absolutely not what the Bible teaches. We've already before proved that. Okay? But he points it out from a historical standpoint and follows on down. And I think I'm going to get out of this now, and I'm going to move on to something else. But that book is The Trail of Blood. Again, if you've not read it, you can find it free, PDF, on the internet. Pull it up, read it. It's literally in the paper copy. It is a booklet about this big and maybe that thick. Okay, little book. We're not talking about something that's going to take a great commitment of time to read, but it is worthwhile. Okay?
May I ask you a question?
You may ask me a question.
In the scriptures, I keep finding it now. It says that they went out from among us to show the world they were never of us. Were they talking about this time that you're talking about? These churches?
Yes, to some extent. To some extent. I think that could be rightly applied to any time. They have went out from us that it might be made manifest that they were never of us, is what the scriptures say. And I think it's anybody that at any time had been numbered among us, that apostatized or left the faith, departed from the truth, and it was.
So it's not no particular church. You just.
No, I don't think so. I think it could be any individual even. I think an individual that knew the way of the truth and departed from it, that could easily be applying to them.
I just always took it as the church in Rome, one of the Baptist churches in Rome. That was me thinking.
I mean, you know, I don't guess I get too mad about you for thinking that, but I've never particularly looked at it that way.
Okay.
So, any other questions before we move on? Because I'm fixing to make a big jump, okay? Because I want to bring in some things where, again, if if there's a group of people right down the road here, okay, and they will, and have proven that they will, come after you, they will take your property, they will take your life, they will take anything and persecute you any way they possibly can, simply because we don't believe the same things about the church, about salvation, about the cause, okay? If those people are right next door to you and you've been persecuted by them, I think it would go without saying that you would understand they're not like we are. I think it would go without saying that anybody that understands anything at all about the Lord's church and the nature of it, that it is a spiritual kingdom, would understand that to enforce anything about a spiritual kingdom by the means of persecution, by the means of the sword, by the means of any of these other things, they could not be considered a church. I mean, to me, that's just a foregone conclusion. Okay? And for years and years and years, that was the case with history. All the way from the beginning up through the end of the Dark Ages, what is commonly called the Enlightenment came in, the Reformation took place, and everybody was so thankful that the Reformation came in because it spread the light of the gospel again, right? That's what you hear. The truth of the matter is that during the whole time that the Reformation was going, there were still Baptist churches in Iraq. Specifically, the churches of the Waldensians. If you can't find anybody else to tie all this together, it is most likely, from a historical standpoint, that the Waldensian churches were planted within 100 years of the apostles. Okay? Even if it was later than that, you're still talking about a church that was so ancient that wherever it did actually begin is lost. Okay? Most likely it was somewhere around 100 years or less after the time of Christ, actually. I said the apostles. But it is very even possible that it was planted by some of the apostles. We just simply don't know. Okay? But if you go back and you look at the histories and you follow it back, there were sound churches in that area that were practicing the very things we believed early on. And then there's a period of darkness there that nobody's really sure, and then they sort of came back to light because the Catholic Church had become so far out that they couldn't stand to let them stay up there and practice as they were, so they started persecution. Okay, so that's when they come back to light. But if they were here at this time and they were over here when the persecution starts, then it is only logical that for all those years in between, they were still there. Okay? They handed it from generation to generation to generation. And they kept handing it from generation to generation to generation until we got actually into the Reformation. During the Reformation, there was a couple of things that happened. One is there was a even greater persecution that came against them. Okay, when you go to cutting on a beast, you know what the beast is going to do? It's going to go to thrashing. Okay, so when you're talking about the Reformation, Germany's getting cut off. Okay, because they went this way. Switzerland is getting cut off. I mean, one went after Martin Luther up in Germany. Switzerland gets cut off. They go as Zwingli. Okay? And there's these new churches that are starting, Reformation churches, protesting, and that's where the name Protestant comes from, protesting the teachings of Catholicism. Okay? Rightfully so. All right? But there have been Baptist churches that were against these things and would not recognize, and that's the thing you look for. And it's quite interesting to me when you read some of the older stuff from the Waldensian churches, they did not consider Catholic priests to be gospel ministers. They didn't consider the Catholic Church to be a gospel church, period. They would rather die than go in and take what they call the Mass or the Lord's Supper. They'd rather give their life than do that. They wasn't going to have no part in it. Okay? So, if you've got that going all the way up to the 1600s, and you've got a church that goes through almost all of that time period, then guess what's happened? The Lord has fulfilled what His promise was. But He'd build His church, the gates of hell would not prevail against it. See, we think there has to be multitudes and multitudes of churches, and there actually probably were. But if there's one church, and I don't mean one group of churches, I mean one church that went through that time unscathed and came out the other side, and from it blossomed out other churches, guess what? The Lord fulfilled His promise.
Yeah.
The gates of hell did not prevail against His church. Okay? And I think that can easily be proved historically. But we come out the backside of that time frame, and when we come out the backside of that time frame, all of a sudden Catholicism comes in. They make a big push, and they were very successful in the push they made. They killed multitudes. They caused a large number of the people to have to go off into exile, into Switzerland. Okay? Reformation. They get over there, they find these Protestant churches that are teaching some of the very things they've been holding to all these years, and they thought they had found help. Okay? At the same time that was going on, a lot, I mean like an overwhelming majority of the preachers that serve the Waldensian churches were killed. I mean, they just came in, they found them when they were there studying, trying to learn. And they killed them. So what had been going on for all these years without their leadership, they said, these men are preaching what we believe, and they brought them back in with them. When they were able to come back, they brought the Protestant ministers back in with them. Now, you may still have a church. You may still have a regenerate candidate. But what you don't have is a scriptural administrator.
Right.
Okay? And that showed up really quickly. Because when they did come back in, it became a conglomeration. It was no longer a pure church. It became a conglomeration of the church and Protestantism. And the end result of that was they lost their power, spiritually speaking. And they began to wither. Okay? As far as what they were teaching, it began to drift. It's been 20 years, give or take. And we were over there and actually got to walk around and see some of that. And the churches that are there now are a combination of what we would think of as modern Baptist and Methodist and the ancient churches, but they are all in a group together. Okay? So they departed. But before they departed, there were some that got away. And they went and found some other brethren, and they continued with them, and they were already there, by the way. And they found others that were sound, and they stayed with them. And the church did come through that time. Okay? At the same time, you got the church that we can find in that same time frame up in England. Okay? So, I mean, there's a whole lot of church history that you can cover in Europe. But if I can start here and reasonably get to an expected place here, and then go a long ways here, and then coming out of it, there's still churches up here, I'm fine. I believe the Lord's fulfilled His promise. Okay, so we get into the English Isles and Wales specifically, and we find churches. Okay? It's from those churches. In fact, 2 or 3 of them in a couple of counties there, they actually organized a church. They got on a boat and they came here. And from that church, most all of our churches around here have eventually come. Okay, that's a long process. Okay, it comes down the coast and then back over up into Kentucky and over in East Tennessee and then spreads back to us. Not going to try to cover all of that, but you've got those churches that came from England, came over, and they came down the East Coast into the Carolina area. They came over to us, Kentucky, East Tennessee specifically, and then from those places, the churches in Middle Tennessee were organized. Okay, and it was a mixture. It was coming in both directions. Okay, but that brings us up to a closer time frame to where we're at. Okay. And so I'm going to pick up right about there, and there's a couple of things, and I know this may sound all scattered, but stay with me a minute or two. I have before me a paper that's called Baptist History, is off the Baptist History homepage, written by a man by the name of Thomas Williamson, whom I do not know, but it is called Landmarkism Before J.R. Graves. Okay, really good little paper. It's not too little, but it's really a good paper. And he starts out with 1851. Okay, so remember we're back here, 1500s. We jump up into England. They come over the 16, so we're mid 1800s now, 1851. Okay, and we find a man by the name of J.R. Graves. We've already mentioned him on more than one occasion. And I have already made the statement here, I don't particularly consider myself to be a landmarker. Okay? However, I will say I do believe the principles that are taught in landmark doctrines. Okay? I don't consider myself to be one because this is what we've always believed.
Right.
So I don't think you need to denominate it. And that's what has happened. If you read much about the history of landmarkism, and I'm not opposed to using the name, okay? I know where Brother Michael is. They have landmark. I know Arkansas has that. Missouri today? Corinth does in Arkansas, but does Missouri? Okay. I couldn't remember if they did. A lot of the churches further out west took that name, Landmark Baptist, okay? Most of our churches around here really didn't take the name. If a church calls itself that, it does not bother me one bit. Okay, I don't want y'all to misunderstand me. I just don't see the need to denominate ourselves again for something that we've already believed for, 2,000 and however many years. Yes, Joe?
Don't the one in Gallatin go by that?
Landmark?
Yeah.
But that's their actual name, just like Goodwill.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not like a denominator.
Okay.
Like it's Corinth Landmark Missionary Baptist Church.
Right.
Okay? And Township Line Landmark Missionary
Sure,
Baptist.
it's what it is.
Yeah. And down where Michael's at, landmark it's a denominator just like we say missionary. Okay? So I don't have a big issue with it. I believe the principles, I believe the teachings, I believe the ideas. And I even believe if you go back and you look at what is actually being taught, they're saying from the very outset, this is not something new. We're going back and resetting what has been lost. And I think that these men were looking back. Okay, so now we're going to tie this back with some history here and the idea of the history that I was looking at. I think they're looking back at places like over there in the mountains and those Waldensian churches. And when they went and tied themselves to Protestantism, what the end result was. Okay? History's 2020 if you're looking back. It's hard to look out in the future and have that 2020 vision. But if I'm looking back, and I'm looking back far enough, and I see what's happened, and I see what the end result of it is, pretty good indication that that's how it's going to happen again. Y'all have heard what one of the definitions of insanity is, right? Doing the same thing again and again and again, and expecting to get a different result. Okay, I mean, you know, we laugh, and it is humorous, but if churches years ago tied themselves to this, and the end result was they lost the candlestick, then if we tie ourselves to this today, what do you reckon is going to happen? And we live in a time, and I mean, we don't think about it this way because we go back, you know, and we say, well, you know, this, as long as anybody I've known or directly know of has known, this is how things have always been. But y'all do remember that it wasn't until the late 1700s that religious freedom really became a thing.
That's right.
Okay? Y'all remember that some of our Baptist people in America were beaten for preaching.
That's right.
For just preaching. Okay? We're not talking about even baptizing, just for preaching. I remember reading an account of one man that was beaten so bad that for a couple of weeks he had to sleep on his hands and knees because the lashes had wrapped around him so bad he couldn't lay down. He couldn't find any way to lay down. For preaching. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. Okay? And so even in the 13 colonies, of all of the 13 colonies, y'all understand, Rhode Island was it.
That's right.
That allowed preaching. Now, there were some others that would tolerate it. But the majority that even tolerated it would require you to still pay your church tax. In other words, support the Church of England or the Catholics or whoever was the dominant religion in that area. All right? So this is where we're coming from. And none of us remember that because we didn't live through that. But I assure you, if that's the case and that's what's going on right around you, are you going to have fellowship with that? I mean, just be honest. If I stand up and preach the gospel and for it a minister of another denomination has been brought before the magistrates and I'm beaten, am I going to want to walk hand in hand with that person? I don't think so.
Brother Greg, if they've not taught anything, if they don't know the difference, they will.
And this is where we're coming to. Okay? What I'm telling y'all is we have lost that idea. And what I see going down through history is that our churches over the years, when that persecution has been pulled back, we have begun to waver. Okay? So now we're in 1851. Cotton Grove, which is just south of Jackson, Tennessee. Big open air meeting or some such, I don't know if it was an association, I think it was an association type meeting, but it was called the Cotton Grove meeting. J.R. Graves steps up, he offers the following resolutions. Okay, and I want y'all to listen to these. See if these are in accordance with what we have been studying thus far. Okay? Number one, can Baptists, consistently with their principles or the scriptures, recognize those societies not organized according to the pattern of the Jerusalem church, but possessing different governments, different officers, a different class of members, different ordinances, doctrines, and practices as churches of Christ? He's asking that as a question. Okay? Second, ought they to be called gospel churches or churches in a religious sense? Y'all always notice when we say churches and we're not talking about us, we say, I'm saying that loosely. Okay? There's a reason for that. Okay? And the answer to that second one is no, we can't really consistently with the scriptures say anything is a church except for a Baptist church. Previously in the first one, can we recognize those societies that are not organized according to the pattern of the Jerusalem church, which is founded on Christ, not on a man, okay? But possessing different governments. Our government has always been not led by the pastor, not directed by the pastor, not controlled by the deacons, but it is a congregational government, always has been. That is found in the scriptures, and that is the way it has continued. Okay? Different officers. We recognize 2 officers in the church, a bishop and a deacon. If you go to some of these, they've got a slew and a half of them. Okay? A different class of members. Church of England will have members that are actual full members, but then they have others that are voting members that really haven't ever made any kind of a profession, any kind of change of heart, but they want their money, so they let them come in and they give them a vote. Literally, yeah, I know. It's crazy, but literally they do that type of thing. Okay? Different ordinances. Okay? And I'm going to say if the church is not a church, then the ordinance is not an ordinance. But to carry this idea further, and I think this is what he's really driving at, they're using baptism as a means of regeneration. They are offering baptism to a different group of people than the Bible authorizes us to give it to. They're giving it to people that have not made a true profession of faith and to children. Okay? So that's a change of the ordinances. Likewise with the Lord's Supper. Okay? They're administering it to unregenerate people. They're administering it to somebody that just comes along and says, yeah, I feel like I can do okay with this. And they're also, in a lot of them, teaching it as something, as well, Catholicism, it actually becomes a saving grace, a part of their redemption, to take the Lord's Supper, Mass, or whatever they call it. Okay? So different doctrines and practices, and we could just, go on for hours on that. Should we recognize them as churches of Christ? Obviously, the answer, no. Obviously not. His third principle. Can we consistently recognize the ministers of such irregular and unscriptural bodies as gospel ministers? It is our custom among our churches. It has been as long as I know. We don't share the pulpit. Okay? This is where this was reestablished. Okay? Understand what I'm saying? Previously, do y'all honestly believe that a group of people that have been persecuted by another group of people would invite the persecutors into their pulpit as brothers to let them preach? That don't make a bit of sense at all. So this didn't happen, okay? But somewhere along the line, churches forgot. Go a step further. Is it not virtually recognizing them as official ministers to invite them into our pulpits or by any other act that would be that would or could be construed into such a recognition? So he takes it a little bit further. It's not only we should recognize them as gospel ministers, we ought not to have fellowship with them as gospel ministers. In other words, don't put them in our pulpit. Don't share pulpit with them. Okay? That's a rough one, but I still believe it. Okay? So we go to the fifth. Can we consistently address as brethren those professing Christianity who not only have not the doctrine of Christ and walk not according to His commandments, but are arrayed in direct and bitter opposition to them? Okay? That's one where a lot of people would choke a little bit, but I think he's absolutely right. How can we call them brethren? Okay? If they're truly saved, their heart's been changed, there is most definitely a relationship that we have with them as a brother. Okay? But if they're in direct and bitter opposition to the truth, it is inconsistent for us to call them brother. And it just, quite frankly, turns my stomach. If y'all don't live here in Westmoreland, you may not appreciate it, but there's a group right around here. It doesn't matter if you're a 3-day drunk. Hey brother, hey brother. It's always brother, 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 brother. I don't dive into all of that. Y'all are my brethren, and I don't have a problem with that at all. Okay? But that's just another way, and in their minds, in what they're saying when they're constantly calling you brother, 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 they're saying, we're the same, ain't we?
Yeah.
No, we're not. Okay? So this is 1851, the Cotton Grove Resolutions. From this arose what we now call landmarkism, or the principles of landmarkism, and David's wanting to say something.
Just real quick, and I know but you didn't say it directly, I just want to be clear about that. There were still churches, obviously, that held to this in 1851.
Yes.
Okay? It was just the city churches, particularly, like Nashville First Baptist, where Graves was a member, that had gotten really weak on it.
Right.
And some country churches got where they would have Methodists to preach their revivals.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But there were those that
Yes.
were firm. A Siloam would have still been, we would have already been organized, and to the best of my knowledge, going back and reading, I still don't know that I sent you those, reading the digital copies of the minutes, we never did that.
Yeah.
So there were still churches that stood firm.
To my knowledge, Siloam has never invited another minister, and we predate 1851. Okay? And I think you would find that to be true, like Liberty. Okay? Now, at the same time, I filled in a church in Franklin. Okay? They had a Methodist church across the road. And their pastor said, yeah, we used to have union meetings, and I went up there. They wanted me as pastor, and I was preaching in a revival. And the first night, the guy I was working with, pastor of church in Bowling Green, a deacon there, at the church he pastored, was raised at this church. And he came and he got up and he's making a talk. And I can get real close to saying what he said, because, boy, when you talk about sticking with you. He was talking about being raised around there. He said, when I was young, he said, I got saved here. He said, I'm not here. He said, I got saved across the road under one of them big trees out back of the Methodist church. And he said, we was having a union meeting. He said, we used to have those here. He said, the Baptists would preach one night, the Methodists one night, and just back and forth, and we shared our revival. He said, and we used to do that all the time. He said, we used to do that till Brother Luther Stewart come up here, and he said, he just wouldn't go for that. Brother L.A., I guarantee he wouldn't go for that. But that stopped the union meetings. Okay? Now, they still shared a cemetery, and they kept doing that up until the 70s, where they'd have a union service about the Decoration Day, right up until the time that the Methodists sent a woman on that circuit, and they said, yeah, we're done with that. So at least they stopped it then. So should have probably stopped it back when Brother Luther was there. But anyway, there were churches that never got involved with this mess. Okay? But some were forgetting. And as a result of that, they were starting more and more liberally to share the pulpit. If you start reading in the early, I'm going to say 1820s up till this time, the circular letters, the queries that used to come up before associations. If y'all are unfamiliar with that terminology, our associations used to, and I guess we still could if we had associations, churches would come up with a difficult idea or a difficult problem that they weren't sure how to handle. So they would send up what they called a query, a question, to the association. The association would read it, they would consider it, they would give their opinion on it, give it back to the church. Okay? If you start in the 20s up until about this time and even past this, you're going to start to see an increase in these types of questions. Ought we to recognize the baptisms administered by another body but were by immersion? And what you're going to find the associations saying pretty consistently, the ones that I've read, no, don't do it. But at the same time, it was happening. First Baptist National, it was happening. They were accepting in baptism that was what we would simply call alien baptism. It was administered by Methodists. It was administered by Presbyterians. It was by immersion, and as long as it's by immersion, they thought, well, that's okay.
Can I throw a bar while you're there?
Yeah.
And of course, J.R. Graves was pastoring Second Baptist Church in Nashville, and I use the word allowed, but y'all know what I mean. While he was pastoring, the church received his mother, Lucy, as a member on her Presbyterian immersion.
They did. Which is completely inconsistent.
Yeah.
But,
Well, and that's why I refuse to take
the
the
name,
name landmark. They were it was political, it wasn't.
it was as
But-
much political as anything with a lot of people. Now, you get out into the country churches.
Yes.
You get out into backside of Macon County. You get out into Trousdale. You get out, this area. You get out of the big cities. Okay? The low-paying churches. They held to what was right. Big-paying churches? But anyway.
That was the case too, of family.
Surely it was.
Family.
It was his family.
Yeah, that still amongst us.
Yeah. It still
Sometimes
happens.
it's family.
Yeah.
This,
So-
this meeting that they had,
Mhm.
wherever he did this,
Cotton Grove.
who all was there?
David
It
correctly,
was-
it was an association meeting. wasn't it?
Yes, but he wasn't, Cotton Grove was not part of the association. So the association was meeting, I think it was actually like a general association. So it was the general association, because they used to have association meetings. And then they would have general associations where 3 or 4 different associations would come together and have a meeting. And Cotton Grove, so he chose while they were there to have a separate meeting that he established and drew from them.
Okay. So, but if you go on through this, you're going to find where this writer, and I'd recommend that you do go through it, you're going to find where that this writer in he is pointing out time and time again. For instance, in 1843, J.S. Reynolds published a study on English Baptists of the 17th century, which is 1600s, okay? In which he stated, the conclusion is irresistible that they did not consider even immersion valid when it was the act of an unimmersed administrator. The principle of action doubtless was that there could be no valid baptism unless the administrator was authorized to baptize by a properly constituted church. That's what we've been talking about here, right? I mean, these same principles. And he takes the time to go through here and show historically a multitude of times that this was going on. And not just on the administrator, but on the church, on the method, on the candidate, all these things, okay? So that would be a good one to read as well. Now, are there any questions right here? From those Cotton Grove resolutions came what we call the landmark doctrines. And that's actually a book, an old landmark reset. Okay, it was actually first an article in one of the papers. That, along with some other writings, were put together in a book. Then there was a second old landmarker book. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. Read it. All right. Okay. Yeah. So there's a couple of different books out there, but a lot of this was fought in denominational newspapers. Okay? And for the I don't know that I want to say for the most part, the city churches never went along with it. Okay? The city churches, for the most part, went right on doing what they were doing. But the country churches, the smaller churches said, this is absolutely right. We will not be a part of it. And it actually shored up things that they had believed that they might have got a little lax on. From place to place, from time to time. I mean, it happened. And that's one of the things that I would recommend to you to think of as you read through history. Do not think that everything that went on 150, 200 years ago is identical to what's going on today, because it was not.
That's right.
Okay? And be honest, if they were doing it, they were doing it. Just let it be that way, go on. Did they fix it? Yes. And did the majority of the churches that we now recognize, did they get away from that? Yes. Okay? But now we're going to go about 50 years forward. Okay? Pretty close. 1896. In 1896, I'm going to pick up what is called the Whitsitt controversy. Dr. Whitsitt was the president and chair of history at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. Okay? He had been elected to this position, and he wrote an article that was published in Johnson's Encyclopedia. Okay? And he wrote this in 1896-ish. Okay? And this carried on for several years. But this is just another quick hit on history here. The gist of what he said, and this is, and I want to be clear about this, to my knowledge, this is the first time that any Baptist writer wrote anything close to what I'm about to read you. Okay? If you go back to the older Baptist historians, they hold an unbroken lineage. They hold it the way I've described here, not by name, but by principle. Okay? They go all the way back, consistently. They show where that Protestants, other beliefs have consistently, when they were having their feet held to the fire, admitted, yes, the Baptists are the only ones that have never identified with Rome, that have maintained these principles down through the ages. Okay? This is an excerpt from a question in Baptist history. Okay? And this is what was written by Dr. Whitsitt. It says, immersion as a religious rite was practiced by John the Baptist about the year 30 of our era. It was solemnly enjoined by our Savior upon all his ministers to the end of time. No other observance was in use for baptism in New Testament times. The practice, though sometimes greatly perverted, has yet been continued from the apostolic age down to our own. As I understand the scriptures, immersion is essential to Christian baptism. This is at the beginning of his book. Okay? As he continues down into the book, and what he wrote in the encyclopedia article is what follows. The earliest organized Baptist church belongs to the year 1610 or 1611. Ezekiel Holman baptized Williams and the rest of his company. The ceremony was most likely performed by sprinkling. The Baptists of England had not adopted immersion, and there is no reason which renders it probable that Williams was in advance of them. Now, did y'all catch what that just said? He said that the earliest organized Baptist church, and that may be an accurate statement by name, all right? It actually isn't, but he's putting it in 1610, 1611. Holman, it says Ezekiel Holman, baptized Williams and the rest of his company, which is a group of people that wanted to be baptized according to the scriptures. And then he said the ceremony was most likely performed by sprinkling. Our churches have been known, okay, for 1,600 years before this, for immersion. And now he's saying they didn't start till 1600s, and this is the president of the seminary, who is also the chair of church history at the seminary. Okay, y'all can imagine how well that went over, right? Now this is 50 years after landmarkism.
This is Mr. Whitsitt.
Whitsitt. Okay, this is 50 years, give or take. Probably more like 45, something like that, whatever it is. After landmarkism. Okay, so all of that's still fresh. Okay, because that didn't just blossom up for a couple of weeks and then die down. That's still fresh to a lot of people's minds. Okay, yes, Joe?
Was there ever any objection to it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is called the Whitsitt controversy.
Okay.
Okay?
For background, Whitsitt's from Tennessee.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Born in Nashville.
He did that?
So, anyway, it got into some of the denominational papers. Dr. Eaton at the Western Reporter, he was actually out of town when it first got published and it first all hit. His sister was running the paper for him while he was overseas. She took up the controversy. I mean, and when he came back, he picked it up as well. And over the next 3 years, 2 or 3 years, it was back and forth before associations, state associations, and the convention. Okay? Completely. Everybody in the country knew. All right? And Whitsitt had 1,000 opportunities to back off of what he said, and instead he doubled down. There was another brother, I can't remember his name right off the Dexter, Dr. H.M. Dexter. And he came along and he said, you know, I was the one that came up with this idea. I was the first one to know this, and pointed to a paper he had written sometime back just a little bit before Whitsitt had written the paper in the encyclopedia. So instead of backing off of what he had said, Whitsitt turns around and argues that no, that's not the case. Me and him had a conversation, and then he went and found the things that I had said and proved them out himself, and he wrote that. I'm still the one that came up with this idea. Y'all hear what's happening here? Okay? This is, look at me, what I've done. Okay? And really, that's what it got to be. All right? But you will find any history written before Whitsitt is absolutely consistent. If it is a Baptist history, and even a lot of the others, they will acknowledge that there are a people that have maintained scriptural baptism and a proper administration of the Lord's Supper from the beginning until the present day. All right, Whitsitt is the first one to really come out and say such a thing as this from among us. Okay, now there were others that questioned.
But even that, most of the Presbyterian, the Protestant writers, as Greg said, acknowledged that Baptists were a
The
completely
oldest.
different creature from the Catholics, and they existed forever, all the way back.
And many historians back that up.
Oh, and you can just, again, I would recommend you on that, back to Dr. Carroll. Trail of Blood. Quote after quote after quote after quote after quote. And you can find those books, a lot of them, online now, and go read it. Okay?
May I ask you a question?
You may.
Did B.H. Carroll ever write anything on it?
B.H. Carroll was J.M. Carroll's brother.
Yes, I
Yes.
understand that.
And B.H. Carroll, hang on just a second, since you asked that,
He was entitled to penalty.
that if Dr. Whitsitt's connection, this is a resolution that is set up by, it looks like the Hopkinsville area churches, okay? The Southern Baptist Theological Seminary shall not be allowed to make any report or present any appeals of any sort whatever to this body so long as Dr. Whitsitt shall be in any manner connected with the institution. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but let me pause. it exploded. Okay? I mean, it exploded. And there was multitudes and multitudes and multitudes of our churches and our preachers that fought this tooth and nail.
Enon Association passed the same resolution.
Yes, and I'm going to read some resolutions in just a minute by a church or by an association out of Kentucky. Okay, because that's really where we're trying to get to tonight. But the second part of this resolution that I'm reading, that if Dr. Witzett's connection with the seminary has not ceased at the time of the next session of the Southern Baptist Convention, we urge that body to adopt, as the only means of preserving its unity, the resolutions proposed by Dr. B.H. Carroll of Texas, which was the year before. And his resolutions basically said, kick him out. Okay? So you asked what his opinion was?
Yeah, I wanted
That was
to know.
B.H. Carroll's.
Yeah.
Okay? And I should have found the actual thing that he wrote, but nevertheless, I think that,
BH headed the Southwest,
He formed the Southwest
yes,
Theological
Southwestern
Seminary.
Theological
And he
Seminary.
get out of all of that before he died.
No, he was still Southern Baptist, but
I know he was.
B.H. Carroll was actually, they called Whitsitt in before the board of directors, okay? And he sort of half-heartedly, didn't really apologize, said this is what I still believe, but I didn't mean to cause controversy. And when I wrote this other, it was to try to get people to discuss it and things like that, but he had multiple opportunities. Well, the board of directors took it and sang a song, you know, How Firm a Foundation, literally, and shook hands with him and cried and all that, right? B.H. Carroll, Texas, not only refused to accept the Wilmington action, but started the controversy afresh. The result of the renewed controversy was the opposition to Dr. Whitsitt was greatly augmented, and the state conventions began taking action calling for the removal of him from theological seminary. So, B.H. Carroll was 100% opposed to that position. Okay? Now, I want to read these word for word.
Before you get too far down the road, can you talk just a second or two about Baptist publication? You talk about the papers, because some of us heard about them, some of us here may not have heard about those things when they started printing.
It used to be, and there actually still are, okay, what are called state papers. And they were denominational papers that were written, usually on a weekly or monthly or bi-weekly or whatever, depending on the number of people. Usually it was a well-known preacher that would serve as editor. It is similar, but on a much bigger scale to what Britt is doing, okay? Doctrinal issues, articles in there, they would, you know, go through all these things. But what happened over the years is that some of these that had large readership or subscriptions, they started using that vehicle as a pulpit. And so they would bring up situations like this, and they would argue it in their paper. Okay, so this one would be arguing against it. Well, there might be another paper in the same state, that another big name preacher, and he'd take up the cause on the other side, and then have this controversy back and forth in their papers. And it drove, because a lot of your well-read, well-to-do people in the denomination, they would take multiple papers. So they were reading both sides of it, you know, and they knew what was, it was the means at the time that we kept one another informed.
The Western Recorder, if I'm not mistaken, was Taylor's original.
I believe he was tied into it.
Yeah, I think he was the original. He was
Yeah.
the first one. And of course, the Tennessee Baptist was started by R.B.C. Howe, and then the second editor was Joe Briggs.
Yeah.
could I introduce just a little bit back across the waters?
Yeah.
About the time that some of this was going on, Spurgeon was starting to fight his own battle over in England in the sword and trial, and some people that came out who was a son-in-law of one of the old guys that was back over, had written something that was controversial. They had a lot of back and forth, started in newspapers, and then Spurgeon started putting it out in his sword and trial. And I ain't saying Spurgeon's just like us or anything, but you can see that Spurgeon is defending more of the old Baptists, that it started over there a little bit before it started here.
Yeah.
Even though Whitsitt brought it out and said he discovered all of this, it had started back across the waters a little bit sooner.
Right.
And it's just a lot more there that if somebody really wants to dig into some history. But if you go back to those early English, back to, you can see that when Vavasor Powell and who wrote Pilgrim's Progress,
Bunyan.
they would go in, they were open communionists, and
Yeah.
they would pastor churches that the churches back in England, they would welcome them in to their communion, but not those churches that were open, the people, those so-called churches. They kept it separate. They didn't, they knew that Bunyan and Vavasor Powell were right.
And a lot of times, we get confused about that term, open communion, because it means different now than what it once did. Open communion to them, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times it meant church to church. That was still a church, okay, not Baptist in Church of England, not Baptist in, now, some of them went that far too.
Some of them had Pentabaptists.
Yeah, they'd allow the Pentabaptists or those that baptized children, okay, they would allow them to come in and they would go in with them. It was a problem. And I think you see a lot of weakness in a lot of the English churches as a result of that.
Orchards are good when on English.
Yes, but where you're going to find that, again, is going to be in around London. You get out around Wales, they didn't play none of that nonsense. And that's where our churches actually come from. Okay, so for whatever that's worth.
But I just wanted to put, there was other controversy and there's other ways of looking at this in history, of going in to see how the devil started digging. Pretty close on both sides of the water.
And for the same ideas, the same reasons, they're looking for something to get a big name. Look what I did. No, I did it. No, you didn't do it. You got it from me. And back and forth. And that goes to the very heart of this, okay? But there's a point I want us to get to. These are a copy of some resolutions that I want to read. Yeah, but we didn't start till 7:15, so I've got a few minutes. So Graves County, I told you Sunday morning, I don't worry about time. I let other people worry about
I'm pretty sure she knew that already.
it. What is called,
Everybody's got their card keys.
what is called the Whitsitt controversy. Okay, this is the Graves County Association out of Kentucky, and these are resolutions that they adopted. Okay, this one was in 1896. It says, well, it's called the Whitsitt controversy had broken over the Southern Baptist Convention by 1896. Graves County Association went on record in the matter by means of a resolution, the author of which is not named as follows. Whereas Dr. W.H. Whitsitt, President and Professor of Church History at the Baptist Theological Seminary of Louisville, Kentucky, has publicly, through the secular press, published to the world and Pentabaptists in particular, that he has discovered satisfactory proof that the Baptists prior to 1641 practiced sprinkling or pouring for baptism and did not practice immersion until after the above date, and that immersion for baptism was introduced about that time as an innovation. And whereas, said Dr. Whitsitt, further teaches and advises that a Baptist woman marrying a Pentabaptist husband should unite with his church, thereby making no difference between Pentabaptist churches and Baptist churches set up by the Lord Jesus Christ in person. And whereas Dr. Whitsitt's position as professor of our theological seminary gives him great weight to his heresies and injury to the Baptist church, the scriptures say, mark them which cause division and offenses contrary to the doctrine which you have learned, and avoid them, Romans 16:17. Now therefore, we deem that Dr. W.H. Whitsitt to be totally unfit to occupy the high and exalted position he now occupies as president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, or even to be a member of the Baptist Church with his heresies. They wasn't playing around about it, was they? It was amended by directing the clerk to send a copy to the Western Recorder with a request that it be published. It was also ordered that the course of the Western Recorder in opposing the Whitsitt theory be approved, and Brother W.M. Wilson and E.G. Roberts were appointed as committee to inform the said paper of the approval. All right? So, that's 1896, 1897. And I want to go back real quick. I said 1897. I want to go back. Okay, all we had talked about so far was the idea of the baptism by immersion starting at 16, whatever. Okay? Did y'all catch when they were reading this? It says, Dr. Whitsitt further teaches and advises that a Baptist woman marrying a pedo-Baptist husband should unite with his church. Turns out that was his sister and her husband, who was a pedo-Baptist minister, and his advice was she ought to go with him. Okay?
Whitsitt is saying?
Whitsitt said that. Okay. So, keep that in mind. So, because that adds another layer to this. Okay? Remember, what we're looking at here is not so much the actual facts, even though you have to have the facts to get there, but what's happening. Okay? 1897, moderator W.F. Lowe presented the following strong resolution as Whitsitt controversy was still raging. Whereas Dr. Whitsitt, president of professor of church history in the Baptist Theological Seminary of Louisville, Kentucky, has published secretly in the Independent, a pedo-Baptist paper, and publicly in Johnson's Encyclopedia and Examiner some articles. And in his book, A Question in Baptist History, statements that prior to 1641, all Baptists practiced sprinkling or pouring for baptism, and whereas he further teaches the Baptist women marrying pedo-Baptist husbands should unite with their husbands' churches, thereby placing Baptist churches on a parity with other so-called churches, and whereas his official position gives weight to his heresies, therefore, resolve that we recommend and demand his immediate removal by the Board of Trustees, that this association withdraw all financial support and advise our young men not to attend the seminary until his removal is effected, that we protest against our Baptist brethren giving their support in any way by vote or otherwise to Whitsittism, that a copy of these resolutions be sent to Joshua Levering, President, Board of Trustees, Baltimore, Maryland, unanimously adopted by the association by a rising vote and without any discussion whatever. They were pretty clear where they stood, right? 1898. Since Dr. Whitsitt had resigned his position as president and professor in the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, the controversy began to subside. Nevertheless, the association adopted unanimously the following resolutions. Whereas Dr. Whitsitt, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, has offered his resignation to take effect next June, therefore be it resolved that we hail with pleasure the promised resignation of the doctor, and we hope and trust that his resignation has no string to it. That we do hereby petition the trustees of the seminary to accept his resignation and put an end to this unfortunate controversy which has caused so much trouble. That a copy of these resolutions be sent to Joshua Levering, chairman of the Board of Trustees, Western Recorder, and the American Baptist flag for publication. Okay. So now we've went through the basis of Whitsitt, okay? So here's what I have pointed out to you in the history, okay? The Lord set up His church, we all agree on that. We jumped within 100 years most likely and we find churches. We can follow those up to the late 1500s, early 1600s. At the same time that they began to wane, we know there were churches in England that adhered to these principles. From those churches in the Isles of England, Wales specifically, our churches have sprung forth. Okay? So we have found a continuous group of people just by that. It's that simple, really. Okay? all of them, we can prove historically, have always held baptism as we hold it, by immersion, with a proper candidate, somebody that's been saved. They recognize church authority because they would not recognize the false churches over the years. We have proven that they also would not recognize as gospel ministers the false ministers. And we find that all the way up until shortly after the Reformation, and then and then religious freedom came in, and then all of a sudden, our people did something. They started to forget. When they started to forget, all of a sudden, they wanted to get along. Okay? Now, do y'all remember where we started out tonight?
First Samuel.
1 Samuel. I'm going to go back and I'm going to read something to y'all. And y'all see if this makes sense to y'all in verse 19. It says, "Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, 'Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.'"
That was the trouble of Israel throughout all time. Once God gave them a king, that they were troubled throughout the rest of the time.
But why did they want a king?
They want to look like everybody else.
They want to be just like everybody else. Okay? Now, I followed this by using baptism. But when you start getting into this stuff, specifically with the landmarkism, specifically with the Whitsitt controversy, baptism is in question. But it goes even, if this is even possible, it goes a little bit deeper. Because it goes back to the very nature of the church. And the idea, and that's why I reread that about him saying it was okay for a Baptist woman to join a Pedobaptist church with her husband because that's who she married. By saying that, he is saying, Whitsitt, that a Pedobaptist and a Baptist church, that there's no difference. Okay? What is the foundational principle behind that idea? Universalism, is it not? A universal church. That there's really nothing distinct about a Baptist church. We're just like everybody else. We're just a little bit different in our beliefs, but we're all churches. Do y'all understand how dangerous that is? And just like Brother John said, when Israel got that, it was nothing but a thorn in their side for the remainder of their days.
That's right.
Okay? And I would recommend to you that if we learn things from history, it ought to be things like this. Can you remember that it was in 1851 that Cotton Grove resolutions were written? No, probably not. And that's okay. But can you remember the principle and what was at stake? What were they fighting for? Why would men... Now, a lot of it, I will wholeheartedly agree, became political. But there are nevertheless principles that were behind it. And though your leaders may go off in a wild direction, that doesn't mean that the rank and file always go to those same extremes.
Right.
Okay? If we lose what we have, then we've lost everything.
Right.
And if we give when it comes to baptism, if we give when it comes to the nature of the church, if we give when it's the Lord's Supper, if we give when we're talking about salvation, then brother, we've lost it. We've already lost it. Because one will necessarily lead to the other. If you get soft on salvation and you start taking people in, you have perverted the Lord's Supper. If you baptize them to get them in and they're not saved, and you know it. Okay? Things have happened. Okay? Even John baptized at least one person that wasn't saved.
Right.
Okay? Keep that in mind. I'm not saying that justifies it. Far from it. I'm saying that there is no justification for baptizing somebody that you know about that's not saved. Okay, I believe Judas gave him the testimony. What it was, I don't know. It was good enough John took it. It sounded right. He said the right things. Okay? He just didn't possess those things. And you can't judge somebody's heart. All right? But if somebody steps up and they're giving what is obviously an unsound testimony of salvation, if they say, you know, when I was 4 years old, I was playing one day and I thought, you know, I'd like to be all right with Jesus. I said, Jesus, come in my heart. I'm going to question that. Okay? And you're going to have to tell me something a little bit more than that. All right? I want to hear about you getting in trouble. I want to hear about you having a heartfelt experience where you know the Lord touched you. All right? If you start playing with that and you baptize that individual that doesn't have a good testimony of salvation, and no, they don't, you're violating the principles of baptism. Okay? And it won't be long. Trust me. It happened with the Waldensian churches. When they took up with the world, and that's what they did. It was happening when J.R. Graves, J.M. Pendleton, and those brethren rose up and said, no, we don't need to be doing this. It was trying to come up again with the Whitsitt controversy. And do not kid yourself, it has not given up. And those churches that we have looked at historically in the most recent years were Southern Baptist churches. Okay? But they were churches we were in full fellowship with. I know that scares people to death to think that, but it is the absolute truth. I mean, you start reading about some of these brethren, and then you go read association minutes, the older association minutes, from the Enon Association, which would tie every church sitting here tonight. One way or the other. It would tie to us. Okay? I can show you their association minutes where they talk about how much money they're going to send to the state convention. And I can show you where some of those brethren that were big in the state convention would come to Enon Association. Their coal porters would come from the state convention. They'd come and they'd beg them for money. And there were some of them that were even allowed to preach before the association. Listen, they were what we are.
Right.
Okay? And that scares everybody. That division didn't come about till the 20s. All right? And it came about because of the 75 million campaign. But at that time, even those that were right in the middle of the controversy, okay? And I'm talking about Cal Gregory, right in the middle of it down there. He said, I give this. He said, and I give it as I please. He said, I'm not trying to tell anybody, and he said this to Dixon Creek, he said, I'm not trying to tell anybody here how you can or cannot give your money. It is your business. Right? Now, to me, that says that he didn't have a big problem with somebody giving money to the convention.
True.
Okay? Now, they wouldn't have it. But anyway, that's a whole other chapter in the book you can buy and read.
Brother Greg,
But my point, give me just a second, Joe. My point is, those things have happened. Don't be afraid of them. Understand they have happened, but learn from it. Learn from it. Learn from these things. Okay? That same trajectory that these brethren were warning against kept going. All right? And in the 20s, they got so worried about the money, they needed the $75 million to carry the gospel to the whole world. And they got it, and then they still didn't have enough, so they kept getting more and more. And y'all remember, most of y'all are old enough to remember going to Nashville, and the biggest buildings in Nashville was the Sunday school publishing houses. Houses, not one. So probably the outside of maybe the state of Tennessee, they had more square footage in Nashville at one time than anybody. Okay? Huge buildings down there where they published. And all of that was to drive that money. Okay? That was the Sunday school board now. But it's a wing of the convention. All right, and they wanted to get the church to where it wasn't that big of a deal. You know what, the last, I think it was in 69 or around in there, maybe in the 70s, they revised Baptist Faith and Message, which is equivalent to what we would think of as 1833 New Hampshire Confession, okay? That's what we still hold to. They took it, they modified, they revised, and they call it Baptist Faith and Message now, okay? And they revise it every so often. And I could stand corrected about the year, but I'm thinking this was in the 60s. They revised it to do away with the idea of the Baptist church being the church. And they went to a universalist position in the Baptist Faith and Message. So see, these brethren were right. They saw it coming. But they didn't listen to him. Poor old Samuel over there. He knew what was going to happen. He had been with the Lord. He said, you solemnly protest against us, and you tell them what it's going to be like. And he did. And they still didn't do it. They said, no, we want to have a king over us so we can be like everybody else. Now, I'm going to finish up my part with this. We're not supposed to be like everybody else.
Right.
And if we learn things from history, that ought to be the things we learn. That we're not like everybody else. You want to read Baptist history? Dr. Carroll was correct in saying that our history is written in blood. And is that the people you want to take hands with? Is that the people you want? And you say, well, but it's not that way anymore. It's not that way anymore because the laws of the land protect us at this current time. Do not hesitate for 1 second to think that if Catholicism was set loose on this world again, that they would be right here tonight cutting us off with the sword. They would do it, they'd do it in a heartbeat and would consider themselves to be doing the service of God. That's reality. And when people broke away from Catholicism and they became Protestants and they got the power, you know what they did? They persecuted us too.
That's right.
Now that's just the reality. They would beat the Baptists. They would kill the Baptists. Church of England, you'd think they were one of the earliest Protestant denominations. You know what they did? They took our people and they burned them at the stake.
Stripped them naked, branded them, threw them out in the wilderness in the middle of the winter, and said they'd kill anybody that gave them something.
Anything. Any kind of help.
Even mothers with their babies.
Absolutely.
Even mothers with their babies.
John Calvin, the Lutherans, all of them killed us.
So,
Absolutely.
question,
Yes.
in 50 years, should the world still be standing? What will people know? Will they be able to find through history where we stood, or are we just lulled
I think so.
in such a sleep that,
I think history will be there. Whether there will be a people that desire
Somebody
to look
read the
for it.
book.
I
Whether there
believe God
will
will
be.
lead his people in his way through this.
Yes.
Yes.
And I believe that's 100% correct.
Yes. And I've said, and listen, I am thrilled that we have the history books we have.
Amen.
But a lot of these history books that were written by Baptist people, they have had to rely on non-Baptist people for the information. Because our people couldn't keep the information. If they did, they would be killed. That's where it's come from. So is it there? Yes, it'll be there. It'll be there. And at the end of the day, as thankful that I am for having that, if it's not there, it's still there. The Lord said, I'm going to keep it. And I believe that. And there's always been a people, and will always be a people that are faithful, though it be few in number. And in 50 years from now, I don't know. I don't know. I would hope that in, 50 minutes from now, that God would send a great revival amongst His people and turn us back.
Has the gospel been every single country in the world?
Yes.
We're the last.
I mean,
I say that happened on Pentecost.
No, I don't think so.
Oh.
well, again, whether it has or has not, the Lord is coming back. We all know that.
Yeah.
And we don't know when He's coming back.
Right.
I know the direction you're going with that question. There's some things that if we knew, we could reasonably put a finger on a time.
Right.
But the Bible's pretty clear we ain't going to do that. So there's some things we just don't really know.
Yeah.
Here's what I do know, and for those of y'all that didn't make it to Goodwill the other Sunday night and Brother John preached, I wish you'd been there. I really do. Here's what I do know. If the Lord says go, we better get up and keep going.
Amen.
Because there's a reason. All of that history that I have pointed out to you is because the Lord said go, and they got up and went. When those brethren were in Wales, and they wanted to come over here to have a better life. But you know what they wasn't willing to come over here without? The truth. So they brought the truth with them. When they got here, they set her up. An old Welsh tract church up there. And then from it came Welsh Neck down in the Carolinas. And then from it came others. And they came over to us. And I mean, here we are. And thank the good Lord for it.
They didn't say, I'm going to go over there to North America and find the truth. They said, we're going to carry it with us.
That's right. That's right.
That's what they did.
And thank God they did.
Amen.
Because of them doing that, here we stand tonight. And we have what we have because they brought it to us. I would say to you that there are many things we can learn from history. Okay? But I think the ideas that we learn from history is where it really values us. Okay? Can I remember that, what year it was that I told y'all just, 10 minutes ago about Whitson controversy started? I could care less if you remember the year. You can look that up. It's wrote in a book. Why was there a problem to begin with? That ought to be what resounds in your heart. Okay, can you remember the name? I could care less. You got to have some of the basics or you're not going to get any of it and you're not going to be able to remember it. I get that. But I don't care if you remember that his name, that he was a doctor or that he was at the seminary or things like, you remember what happened. That's what's important. Because that's what we'll carry with us. And that's what will change our thinking, change the way we approach our service to God. That is the value of history. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, Joe, ask your question.
This happened several years ago in our association. That's the last one I ever went to. That's the last one we ever had. And they were, one of the preachers was wanting to take members in and baptize them after they got saved. And we quit fellowship. We quit the whole association. I remember that very plain. I was there that night. I know who the preacher was. It was split.
Say that again. Because what you just
Yeah.
said, if I'm not mistaken, was that there was a preacher wanting to take people in after they got
Oh,
saved and
yeah.
baptized them.
Yeah, yeah,
Was you?
no.
Well, there you go.
It's the opposite.
Brother.
It's the
No, you
opposite.
said that opposite.
If Brother Willie, Brother myself, Brother Thompson was there.
Say it again, Joe. Say it again. I think you're saying it backwards.
What?
What you said was that he wanted to take people in after they got saved and
No.
baptize them.
Before they got.
Thank you. Okay. That's why I was looking at you so strange. I was like, what?
What's wrong with that?
Kind of what we've been arguing for, but no, yes.
Yes.
And listen, we are susceptible to it.
Yeah. I
We
mean, we was
are.
talking about, these things coming in, and that always comes up in my mind, what happened that day.
These were churches,
Mm-hmm. This
okay?
was a church, it still is today.
And I'm talking about what we think of as Southern Baptist churches today, and we wouldn't recognize, I understand that, but at that time, 150, 170 now years ago, they were just like us.
Yeah.
We would have recognized them. We did recognize them. We were in fellowship with them. Okay? They were what we now are.
The Southern Baptists did not become a denomination overnight.
1864,
Yeah, but it was not a denomination.
But that was not a denomination. Right.
It was a convention that would take your mission money and send it to missionaries that were doing work.
Right.
Both Enon and Wiseman Association were numbered as supporters of the
Convention
Southern
supporters.
Baptist Convention. They were convention
we
associations.
fellowshipped a lot of them.
And
Oh,
all of them.
All of them.
In
At the
fact,
beginning,
the
yeah.
first Tennessee Baptist Convention, a member of Dixon's Creek, William Martin, was the pusher of the first convention. But it didn't become the denomination that we know today until much, much later. In the 1920s, 1930s, they began putting out statements of faith, the faith and message.
Right.
And when they began to say, this is what you're going to believe or else,
Right.
that's when it became an issue.
Now, they'll still take your money, you just don't get a vote.
Yeah.
Okay?
But it was
didn't
not
they-
a denomination when it started.
Right.
Ever how much money you gave, it gave you a
Yes.
president,
X number of dollars equals one vote.
Yeah, yeah.
Captain
Or one-
Bowie Mason was a representative of both Wiseman and Enon at different points of time, associations,
Yeah.
at the Southern Baptist Convention.
I remember reading that,
But it was
Part of it
not
was,
a denomination.
Membership. And then it got to where you could
You
buy votes.
You got X number of votes for
For
members.
members.
And then, well, you had X number of votes for just joining, like 2 votes, okay? Then as you had 100 members, you got another vote. Every 100 members, you got another vote. But then they did the same thing with the income. If you gave, we're gonna say, $100, you got another vote.
Yeah.
If you gave another $100, you got another vote. You see, so that'll start telling you what it was about. It was about getting the big churches with the big money, and that's what it became.
I probably
That's
wouldn't
what it
have
became. Okay? The sad thing, and I'm going to stop, but the sad thing is, I really do believe that the men that started it had the absolute best of intentions and wanted to get the gospel out. That's the whole purpose of getting the Triennial Convention and the Southern Baptist Convention. That's what it was for. It was never meant to be a denomination. It was meant to be a means to elicit, how was it they put it? Elicit, put them all together and distribute the monies of the churches.
In an organized fashion.
In an organized fashion, yes, something like that. There's when they incorporated in Georgia, it's in there, but the whole point is they meant to do right, but they erred Because the whole plan that God has ever set out is that the church sends the people.
That's right.
The local
I can't understand
individual
why
church.
they didn't understand that.
Well, I think, and listen, at the beginning, for the most part, that was still the way it was going. But then they were a supplemental means of support. But then it just kept, when you start out wrong to begin with.
Well, that's true.
You also have
It
to
is the nature
remember,
of sin, it just continues to grow.
you know, we're talking 1840s.
Rice and Luther,
Well, Rice and Lutheran, that's a whole nother issue, because Rice, that's the, yeah, we're not gonna go there. Yeah, hope, yeah, don't,
But
don't get me
anyway,
started with them. Now, what I was saying. Oh, 1840, 1830, 1850, 1860, 1870, even 1900. There was, we think today that, okay, you can easily communicate that Siloam has a preacher that's going to Indonesia, okay? 1830s, you couldn't.
no.
And it was so difficult, and that's what they were trying to overcome.
Yeah.
The churches at first were still sending the missionary. The
Yeah.
missionary was still coming out of Siloam and going to Indonesia, and then of course that's just made up, and going to Indonesia. But the convention would funnel funds to that preacher. But then they got to the point when they started doing the faith and message that they said, okay, we're not going to send you money unless you believe this, and this.
And you gotta sign off on it.
Got to sign off on it.
yeah.
And it very quickly became the only ones that got money were seminary, which became a part of it, trained preachers. Right.
So the intent, now it was never good, okay, because they missed the boat. But the intent of it at first, like Greg said, was not to form a denomination. It was to help
Yeah.
spread the gospel. And that's why our people support it.
Yeah.
Uzzah had some good examples.
Who's
that? Uzzah, I'm not pronouncing his name.
Oh, I don't
He
know.
reached out and grabbed the ark of
I'll try
God
to keep
and
it
it fell off the cart.
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
He had some good intentions.
He meant well, didn't he?
We should have listened to told him not to touch it.
Joe, you know,
Well, you tell me not to touch the stove, I'm sorry.
I mean, he had respect and for
y'all let
what
stuff
he
back there.
represented, he didn't want to get in the ground.
It's wet.
So, all right. Anybody else? Thank y'all for sticking with me. I know we got long, but I hope the point got around.
I enjoyed it.
Lord willing, next week we will pick up with Lord's Supper. I'm done with history. If you want more history, I'll give you 50 different ways to get it, or actually 2 really good ways. Buy a book. They'll be here next week. Or I gotta throw in the plug, y'all know. Okay, it's sort of like when they put the Cokes in the movies. Gotta throw in the plug.
It's all because his name's within the first 3 pages.
You get a roll.
You know.
Get a roll. You got a free book. That's all I got. Okay, but go on to that Baptist history homepage. Huge amount of information there. And I mean a lot.
Is that where you got all of your stuff tonight?
All of it except for the Trail of Blood, but I think there is the Trail of Blood on there as well. I'm not 100% sure, but if you're looking for the Trail of Blood and it's not on Baptist History homepage, if you will try Trail of Blood PDF, it'll pop up. And you can save it and print it.
Let me give a third one. If you go to, Brother Mitch did an excellent job of recording our history study at Siloam.
Thank you.
And if you go to the Siloam Church Facebook page,
Yes.
they're on there. So if you go back 3 years now, if you go back 3 years, they're all on there.
And how many was that? 7 or 8?
Well, yeah, because we got closed down with COVID.
Yeah. I can't remember, but we had several.
Right at the end of it though.
That's right.
I used to go to Texarkana, it was a Baptist bookstore
Still
in
there.
Texarkana, and one in Maine. I used to go to that one up there.
Texarkana is the Baptist Missionary Association, which is one of those that came out of the landmark movement.
Oh,
And
okay.
it has had some really good books. Mitch and I were out there a few years ago, we found a few things. A lot of it was not so good, I'll put it that way. We had to get back to the ancient and old corner, and then we found some worthwhile stuff, but,
Very scratched.
yeah. I mean, it,
Scratch and dead cell.
The very scratched corner.
stuff that had, about that much dust on it, we wiped her off and said, oh, okay. But, it's changed, so, anyway,
Let's remember DJ and Lindsay.
yes, certainly remember them, Lord willing, Wednesday at 5 o'clock, they're going into the hospital, right? And she's gonna be induced, and just pray that everything will go smooth and good. Y'all pray for that little fella, because, he ain't even born yet, but it ain't gonna be just a few years and he'll
Right.
look up one day and he'll realize he needs the Lord. So pray for him. Pray for him that when that day comes, he'll come quick and he'll bow down and he'll get things worked out quickly. And then go on and be a great servant for the Lord. Anything else? Stand again. Brother Shane, could you dismiss us?
Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for this night, and thank you for all of our many lessons. Thank you that we have this freedom to meet together. We ask you that you would watch over this nation, that generations to come may still have this freedom, and that they would want it. Father, we ask you to just go with us tonight, to be with us, to keep us always humble and submissive to all that you have given us. And Father, help us, no matter what we think and want to study about history, to remember that it's been your hand that has brought your people down through all the ages. And we know and have faith that you will continue somewhere until you come back. Just be with us, keep us always humble and submissive. Do your will. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.